fight is finally over, a moment that the world has been closely waiting and watching for. Russian President Vladimir Putin is in India and the images of his arrival are already breaking the internet. That Modi-Putin hug, that powerful handshake is once again dominating global headlines. In a move no one saw coming, Prime Minister Narendra Modi went to receive President Putin at the airport. It was a gesture that Kremlin itself called unexpected. And then another headline, a few minutes later, when the two leaders decided to share a car ride side by side, a photo from inside the car has also surfaced, capturing the warmth, the camaraderie, and a bond that's only getting stronger with time. Just a short while ago, Prime Minister Modi hosted President Putin for a private dinner at 7 LKM. That is the official residence of Prime Minister Modi. But tomorrow is a big day. Two global leaders, one formidable friendship, and a geopolitical test watched by every nation in the world. All the capitals from Washington, D.C. to Beijing are watching and seeing every move that will be playing out in the next 24 hours. But let's talk about the big India Today exclusive now. In an exclusive conversation with India Today's Geeta Mohan and Aaj Tak's Anjana Kashyap ahead of his India visit, Vladimir Putin hailed India's post-independence rise as almost a miracle. He also praised the reliability of India-Russia energy ties and stressed that their partnership has never been used against any other nation. Vladimir Putin also strongly defended India's right to buy Russian fuel and voiced confidence in Donald Trump's sincerity about seeking peace in Ukraine. We have been playing that exclusive, but let's first understand from the guests who are joining me here as to what they think are the big takeaways. But first up, big breaking news coming in now. These are the images of Prime Minister Modi and President Putin from 7 LKM. The bonhomie is on full display. Prime Minister Modi, in fact, hosting President Putin for a private dinner after welcoming him at the tarmac. Prime Minister Modi and President Putin chose to travel in the same car and they went straight to 7 LKM. Joining me on this broadcast, Veena Sikri, former diplomat. Dmitry Babich is political analyst and deputy foreign editor at KP. And we also have Sandeep Unitan, senior journalist who is at our network. Sandeep, let's talk about the interview here. What do you think is the big takeaway? I mean, an interview which is extremely newsy. Just about every global press has been waiting for this interview. They'll be quoting us tomorrow, but for you, as a journalist who has been tracking this world of diplomacy closely, what do you think is the big takeaway?
Well, Maria, firstly, this is one of the longest interviews that President Putin has ever given to a foreign journalist. The previous one was last year in 2024 when he spoke to Tucker Carlson. That was his first interview to any Western journalist after the war in Ukraine. He spoke for nearly 2 hours. This is the second biggest interview, and this is a world exclusive because it comes at a time when we are talking peace, the possibility of an end to the Russia-Ukraine war in Europe, but that's not happening right now. That's at a stalemate. But this interview, Maria, is really important because from this you get an idea of where Putin is, where he sees Russia today. And what we are looking at, possibly judging from his responses to Anjana and Geeta, is the fact that we are witnessing one of the biggest events, one of the biggest geopolitical events of the 21st century, which is that Russia, a country that straddles Europe and Asia, traditionally has been in two continents, now is looking at moving towards Asia. It is pivoting towards Asia. It's pivoting towards these two giants, China and India. And that is the sum and substance of what President Putin is conveying over here, that he's invoking the spirit of RIC without saying as much, but he sees Russia, India and China as being a formidable counterweight to the Western-led bloc, Maria.
Yes, and Dmitry, what is the mood there in Moscow? How is this interview being seen? Of course, you know, there are a lot of takeaways. I'm looking at what President Putin has said in the context of the Russian oil industry. President Putin said that while there has been slight decline in the first 9 months and minor adjustments, overall trade remains steady. He added that the Russian oil industry considers its Indian counterparts to be very reliable.
Well, you asked me this question, and I can respond to you with dozens of quotes from the Russian media. The main mood is that India has proven its sovereignty because when President Trump tried to pressure India into refusing Russian oil, you probably remember Prime Minister Modi had the courage just to stop talking to Trump for several weeks. You know, Mr. Modi did not receive the phone calls from Trump, which was, of course, a huge surprise for Washington because for many years we have spoiled American presidents by making them believe that everyone is waiting for their calls. Every call from them is a huge honor. And here we see, I think, sincere honor, sincere respect on both sides during this meeting of Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. And you can read it from these images. And of course, you can read it from the interview. So my impression is that this summit meeting proves one more time that Russia and India have become much wiser in the last few decades, I would say. The West keeps talking about market economy, but actually the sanctions, especially the secondary sanctions, which the West imposes on all of its opponents, these are non-market measures. These are attempts to go against market economy. What is a price cap for Russian oil? This is exactly what the Soviet Union did with the prices in the worst period of our history when we had huge economic crisis in the end of 80s. So Mr. Putin, from his experience, he knows that if there is a product and if there is a buyer, the product will find its way to the buyer. So the Russian oil will find its way to India. And India has the capacity to refine this oil, to make it into more valuable products. And these refined products will find their way to Europe. So what we see is the victory of market economy over ideology, because the only reason why the West is still discriminating against Russia, against China, against Turkey, countries whose elites were not anti-Western, I can testify it from my many years of experience, many interviews that I took from, Russian diplomats, Russian government officials, Turkish diplomats, Turkish government officials.
Yes.
Many
I'm going to come
officials,
back to you,
they
Dimitri.
were all not anti-Western.
Let me take an opening comment also from Ambassador Sikri. Ambassador Sikri, while we talk about the fact that Russian president is here in India and he has some great things to say about India and India's growth post-independence. He has also spoken about the Russia-India ties and that dosti which we keep emphasizing on. But let me take you through his important comment with regards to Donald Trump. He says that there is a great degree of sincerity with which Donald Trump seems to be approaching peace in Ukraine. He says that absolutely no doubt that President Trump had genuine intentions. I'm confident that his efforts to bring peace to Ukraine are sincere. And then when the question was, I'm absolutely certain that he's sincere about bringing peace to Ukraine and genuinely wants to save lives, but there are also economic and political interests involved. And I think that's where the story lies, that there are political interests, that there are interests of the NATO nations here.
I think, thank you very much for that. I think that first and foremost, I'd like to see this interview of President Putin coming across as a statesman. I think he is very careful and cautious in his comments, but he's also speaking very sincerely. You can see the sincerity. And of course, this is a complete opposite of what the West is trying to paint him as. But the very fact that he's giving President Trump the credit for his peace plan and saying that, yes, he's sincere is part of this his own statesmanship and his own approach, and he seems to be keen on basing the solution on what President Trump is suggesting. So he's accepting many elements of the President Trump peace plan, though not all. But at the same time, he's quite categoric in what he says, that he does not want to join the G7 again. He does not want to be the G8 again. So he is, in this sense, turning his back on what had been a big plank of Soviet and then Russian foreign policy, to make friends with Europe. And it looked like Europe too, after two world wars fought in Europe, had been keen on, making friends with Russia, former Soviet Union also, and having a long-lasting peace with economic development in that part of the world, in Europe. But that's just fallen apart. And I think President Putin is calling that out for what it is, that
Yes.
it has fallen apart, that the West does not, at least Europe, is no longer interested in, diplomatic, cordial, economic, normal relations with Russia. And so he's turning his back on them. He's certainly turning towards Asia. And he is very appreciative of India's role, again, not just in the immediate context, but in the long-term context. So this whole history of the relationship between India and Russia, the civilizational aspect of the relationship, the spirituality, the long tradition that we have. His focus on all of this is positioning himself not just as a person who's in charge in Russia today, but in a much broader perspective. So I think that's an important
Let me bring
part.
it Sandeep again. Sandeep, we are focusing on one of the big takeaways which India has been repeatedly speaking about, that there is a great degree of hypocrisy with the manner in which these sanctions against India has come. It stands at 50% tariffs. With regards to India purchasing the crude Russian oil, here is Vladimir Putin calling out that hypocrisy. He's saying that United States still buys nuclear fuel from Russia for its own power plants, including uranium for reactors operating in the US. He questioned why India should not have the same privilege, adding that the matter deserves a thorough examination, that Russia is ready to discuss it, including with President Trump.
Absolutely, Maria. And it was called out in so many words by President Putin, the double standards that Russia has been subject to, and India especially. The fact that this is something that we have pointed out as well, that China, for instance, has been importing far more Russian oil than India, but it gets away with a lighter tariff burden, whereas India gets the full brunt of the United States, more than 50% tariffs. It's unreasonable, and it comes from none other than President Putin, that he himself sees the folly of the double standards that the United States, which is one of the largest buyers, incidentally, of fertilizers and rare earths and uranium from the Russian Federation. And he said it in as many words, that this is, double standards. The West says one thing, it practices another thing, and it preaches, a third thing. So this is President Putin for you, at his candid best, calling out Western hypocrisy, while at the same time treading that very, walking that tightrope when it comes to making sure he doesn't criticize the United States and, especially President Trump, because the US is pushing a peace plan in Europe. It is Europe that is not in favor of the kind of terms that are being discussed right now, Maria.
Yes, and this visit, as we have been talking about the timing of this visit, Dimitri, it's important because just 48 hours ago at Kremlin were the emissaries or envoys of President Donald Trump, in which President Putin has sent a clear message to Donald Trump with regards to the peace deal, including to Donald Trump's son-in-law. And then he visits India, a country which faces 50% of tariff, which is almost like a penalty that India is facing. But when it comes to his clarity about the end game in Ukraine, here is President Putin telling Anjana and Geeta in that interview that Russia did not start the war, and he has blamed the West for pushing Ukraine towards conflict. He has added that Russian citizens in Donbass were persecuted and emphasized that Russia's deep ties with Kyiv remains, and that his endgame certainly will be about completely liberating Donbass. So that's a reiteration of what this entire war began with. The
You are
goal of this
absolutely
war.
right. You are absolutely right. And we feel that people in India understand better than anyone that there are some wars which are provoked by the West, which are not the fault of the nations which participate in these wars. We know that the wars that followed the British withdrawal from India, they are not the fault of the peoples of India and Pakistan. They are the fault of the Western elites, which made Muslims and Hindus quarrel and which capitalized on that conflict. In the same way, believe me, in the same way, we are now going through the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let me remind you that it was not Russia who interfered in Ukraine in 2014 when the legally elected president Yanukovych was ousted with open support from the European Union and from the United States. There was German foreign minister encouraging the protesters, the so-called peaceful protesters, to attack the residence of the president. When Yanukovych was ousted, 38 policemen were killed and hundreds were maimed by these so-called peaceful protesters, paid and armed by the West. So that was the beginning of this war, which had begun much earlier than 2022, but still it is a tragedy which we want to be ended as soon as possible. And you are absolutely right. The fact that Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of President Trump, the fact that Steve Witkoff came to Moscow with a secret mission, that they are not involved in any ideologies. They are doing diplomacy, diplomacy aimed at ending this conflict. This is a huge encouraging sign. And when we hear from the BBC and from the European media, oh, this mission has failed, Putin has refused everything. This is
Okay?
simply not true.
Yes. So the fact is that Vladimir Putin's presence in India is being watched, as I've been saying, Sandeep, by all the capitals across the world,
Exactly.
from Washington, D.C. to Beijing, to London, to just about every capital that you can think of, because tomorrow is the day of the bilaterals, it's the day of the summit. It will be the day of the banquets, and of course the big meetings which will be taking place, and the joint statement between India and Russia. Really appreciate your time, Dmitry, Ambassador Sikri and
Thank you.
Sandeep. Tomorrow morning is when our special broadcast starts, so do tune in.